is also a kind of slight sign of desperation that what they're looking at in terms of what they've already done, which has been this kind of assault on the NICs and trying to reduce NICs. And of course, they've signalled their intention to scrap NICs altogether. That's national insurance contributions, which Labour are now seizing upon as a sort of massive attack line, this £46 billion black hole in the country's finances. But there seems to be some kind of acceptance from the government that that hasn't cut through.
Let's talk some politics. Big story in the Times this morning. The Conservatives are considering cutting stamp duty in the autumn statement later this year. Like I said, lead story in the Times. The Treasury's drawn up plans to increase the threshold at which people start paying the duty from £250,000 to £3,000, meaning nearly half of all people buying homes would pay no stamp duty at all. Where's this come from? Has this been long planned? Is it a sudden sort of pre-election vote-grabbing ploy? What's happening there?
So I think that this is about an election. I think this is about the government starting to whittle down its options for what it's going to do in its kind of giveaway bonanza budget, which is expected before the election. We're still thinking that there will be a further fiscal statement in September, probably ahead of there being an election sometime in the autumn. It's interesting because ordinarily when you have a financial statement, you start hearing about the things leaking from it about a month out.
Yeah.
So it seems a little bit premature to be talking about some of those things. But I think that this is all being done in the context of the fact that there's clearly some discussions going on about how long this government is going to last and when they are going to pull the trigger for an election. As you'll have seen in the read that's been done today in the Times, there's clearly been some discussion about whether they're going to go early, whether they're going to do that in June or July, particularly as we are likely to see a bad set of local election results. And that will put pressure on the Prime Minister over his future and whether or not there will be further attempts to try to get rid of him. And so I suspect that this is all being had in those discussions about, you know, what they're going to try and do to try and sort of feather their own nest as we head into that kind of election season. But as I say, it is rather early to be talking about it if we are going to see this government go long.
Well, some people were making the point this morning that if you announce this now, what that effectively does is, at this level, shut down the housing market for the next 6 months. Because who's going to want to buy now when they could pay less tax in whenever this happens? Which seems to be a sort of seems to be something that a more cautious and careful government wouldn't have done.
Yes. I think that's fair to say. But I think it is also a kind of slight sign of desperation that what they're looking at in terms of what they've already done, which has been this kind of assault on the NICs and trying to reduce NICs. And of course, they've signalled their intention to scrap NICs altogether. That's national insurance contributions, which Labour are now seizing upon as a sort of massive attack line, this £46 billion black hole in the country's finances. But there seems to be some kind of acceptance from the government that that hasn't cut through.
Yeah.
So they are now looking for further sort of tax changes and offers to the public, which they hope will be potentially received in a more kind of favourable way.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely. I think that's fair to expect. Let's talk about the Mark Menzies story, the quite mad. The quite mad story about the backbench MP who asked a senior elderly constituency worker for money in the middle of the night for bad people. He's since had the whip withdrawn and so on. Where's this going? And particularly, is there going to be any response, any comeback from the fact that the Conservatives appear to have sat on this story for 3 months without doing anything about it until it appeared in the Times this week?
Well, I think there will be some comeback on it. And, you know, I'm surprised that there haven't been sort of further investigations launched on the back of it. I mean, it looks on the face of it like it is, you know, bona fide corruption. It looks like there may be other sort of illegal elements of it involved. You know, I think the expectation is that this could unravel quite quickly, that there's more to come out, that this has been going on for quite some time. And I think that, you know, we haven't seen the last of it. But it's always difficult at this stage because I guess, you know, the information will be referred to all the authorities that need to be aware of what's gone on. And I expect that we'll hear much, much more about it in the future. I'm trying to be diplomatic because obviously we often know more about what's going on behind the scenes, but actually it's difficult to divulge that information without leading to libel cases. So we have to be slightly careful.
I always love it when you or Harry say, I expect we'll hear more about this in the future, as if you weren't literally political editors who know very well what we're going to hear about in the future. I guess, look, particularly with this one, I mean, I don't mean not specifically to this story, but in general terms, when you have something like this, when you find out that a party has been well aware of something like this for many, many months and has not done anything about it, is that normally cover up? Is that normally chaos in your experience?
A bit of both, I think.
Right.
And of course, there are things that you can point to which have brought down people, thinking about Boris Johnson in particular and the Chris Pincher case. If you think about the parallels there, I can tell you now that the Sunday Times have been working on a story about Chris Pincher's activities for 6 months before that happened. And he accidentally happened to have touched somebody in an inappropriate way and it be witnessed at the Carlton Club. And, it led to this unprecedented sort of chain of events. But it was the cover-up that did for Boris Johnson ultimately. And the fact that he said that he wasn't aware of anything to do with Chris Pincher when, for example, we knew perfectly well that he had, because we'd put some of the more lurid revelations that we were hoping to reveal as a paper, and indeed never did, to him to question him about what it was that he had known. And of course, he stated publicly that he had no idea. We subsequently found out that he did. And it was that cover-up that did for him. So it's a dangerous game, all of this, when people are, have this put on their radar and then don't do anything about it.
Yeah.
In this particular case, I'd been aware of rumours about this particular individual since January. The nature of these allegations actually make it quite difficult to investigate unless you are talking directly to the whistleblower, which, of course, in this case, our fabulous investigations reporter was doing. But, you do pick up on these stories from time to time, and it's very hard, I think, the way that we do live in a kind of Westminster village to kind of keep these things quiet. And if they have been referred, for example, to the Whip's office or to other authorities, journalists tend to know about these things fairly quickly. So it is pretty dangerous. But what I think is more extraordinary about this story is what on earth is going on in Parliament. We seem to have had just a run of these kind of, salacious and scandalous stories.
We were saying earlier, it's very 1990s.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. But also, I was fascinated by the comment piece written by Matthew Paris this morning about, what it is that often makes MPs tick and actually propels them into these jobs. And if you think about it, and, I think about it sometimes, if I were living on a kind of knife edge all the time on a kind of 5-year cycle of whether my career was going to blow up in smoke based on, what was going on with the poll of a national party, you have to be quite a big risk taker to gamble your career on that kind of thing.
Well, I guess, but I think it would make me live like a monk. I don't know.
Well, I guess it makes people go either way, really, doesn't it?
Yeah. Anyway, for more on the Mark Menzies story, of course, Billy Kember, the Times senior investigations reporter who uncovered that, he's been speaking to Luke Jones for the story, the podcast, the story. So get it on. Yeah, listen, download the latest episode of the story, available wherever you get your podcasts. Caroline, I also want to ask you about Israel and Iran. And basically where Britain is with all that. Look, obviously we, as Britain, helped out Israel defend itself against the Iranian attack last weekend, a week ago today, in fact. And yet one does get the sense that in the run-up to that, and indeed since that, Israel hadn't been paying an awful lot of attention to what either David Cameron or Rishi Sunak said. Where are we now with the diplomacy? Do we have more of Netanyahu's ear than we used to, do you think? Or is this just something that we as a country were obliged to do because it was in our strategic interests?
Well, I think there is a part of that. The sense I get from having spoken to sort of sources within government is that Netanyahu is pretty bullish in terms of what he wants to do. There had obviously been a lot of lobbying of him not to retaliate against Iran. And actually, if you look at what did happen, there's an argument to say it was a fairly muted response, or at least Iran has certainly downplayed the impact of the response that has come. I don't think Bibi, as he's known in circles, is going to start necessarily listening anytime soon. It's a pretty difficult situation when you've got Joe Biden, the US president, who has been saying, increasingly sort of bullish things to them about how they need to respond to this crisis, particularly given the humanitarian crisis that's unfolding in Gaza. But I don't get the sense that this is going to change much, particularly quickly. There may be some relief, particularly within Whitehall today, that perhaps the response is such that it's not going to lead necessarily to a dramatic escalation in the tensions. But I think there there is still at the kind of back of this a kind of bone of contention really with Israel, that they don't seem to be listening to what the Western leaders are saying to them, and they are really continuing to pursue their own interests. Now, we have very publicly stated our allegiance to Israel. There is still very much a sense within the government that Israel needs to be able to defend itself against these attacks. But, the sense I get is just ongoing frustration that we don't seem to be able to have any sort of greater impact in terms of what's going to happen, with that humanitarian crisis as it stands.
Despite our military involvement,
Yeah,
indeed.
but also, the thing that I think is more interesting actually about the Israel situation is, the frustration that you're now seeing from the Ukrainian leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, on the basis that we did intervene and we did have our fighter jets up there shooting down drones. And of course, what we do know about what's going on in Ukraine is actually they do have a shortage of air defence missiles at the moment. And I think, that's something that's kind of becoming an increasing issue, I think, for David Cameron. And certainly when I sat down with him in Beirut at the start of the year, he was very clear to me that actually it wasn't the Middle East that was keeping him awake at night so much as what was going on in Ukraine.
Well, that's cheery. Look, one more before I let you go. The smoking ban, which passed through the Commons this week, the government's smoking bill. It did pass, but it was a free vote. So there was quite a large rebellion. People like Kemi Badenoch voted against. What's the politics here? Is it all right that the people who voted against? Will Rishi Sunak be all right with that?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, one of the things that they've pointed to is that actually the rebellion against the Tony Blair government was actually bigger when they tried to ban smoking in cars and public places. So actually, there is kind of precedent for this. I think what it says more about is actually the leadership posturing that's going on, and the fact that those libertarian sort of MPs, such as Kemi Badenoch, but we also saw Penny Mordaunt, for example, abstain from the vote, are definitely making overtures to the right of the party in particular, who don't like this kind of nanny state interventions. So I think it tells us more about what's to come next in terms of the issues and the policies that are perhaps going to play a kind of more dominant role in future leadership contests than it does about the state of the Conservative Party at the moment. I think, clearly there is an issue with discipline at the moment. Rishi Sunak seems to be trying to solve problems and issues that perhaps, nobody's particularly interested in. I don't think smoking was sort of top of the list of policies that they would have wanted to see pursued by a Conservative government. And I think that, people are obviously showing that there is a bit of a kind of lacklustre sort of mood within the party. But I don't think it does him any particular damage. But I think it does tell us more about what is to come in the future.
Blimey. Well, thank you very much, Caroline Wheeler. And you can, of course, read more from Caroline in the Sunday Times tomorrow. And you can order a copy of Caroline Wheeler's book, Death in Blood, in the Times Bookshop. Simply go to timesbookshop.co.uk now. And those two things combined tomorrow. Caroline has another big blood contamination story in the Sunday Times tomorrow. So do look out for that, as well as buying her book, of course.